the least Khorn-like Khorn Chaos Space Marine Warband, the Brazen Beasts. Now, I know we don't talk anywhere near enough about Chaos Warbands on here. Partially that's because GW really doesn't seem to give a shit about Chaos Space Marine Warbands. A problem that I am perpetuating by, well, not talking about the handful of warbands that actually do have some lore out there. We are going to try to fix that today. Or at least lay the gentle foundations of the beginnings of a fix. So, the Brazen Beasts. They're an interesting little warband because, one, they're a renegade Chaos Space Marine chapter that wasn't created by the Ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition, which, it's a shame to say it, but that's actually rather unusual. 9 times out of 10, it is the actions or inactions of either the Ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition that is the foundational story for Chaos Space Marine chapters. But not the Brazen Beasts. They were created in a far more honest sort of way, through good old-fashioned warp fuckery. In this case, I'm pretty sure that Khorn was playing with his Transformer toys, or Hot Wheels, and decided it sure would be fun to have these in real life, but bigger, spikier, and angrier, as that is the only explanation I can conceivably come up with for the origin stories of these red and brass lads. See, they were originally a force from a Space Marine chapter known as the Golden Blades, that we know absolutely nothing of, so they were literally just invented to further the creation of the Brazen Beasts. Anywho, a garrison force of the Golden Blades, who just so happened to contain the majority of the chapter's motor pool, convenient, was assaulted by an enormous demonic horde of Khornate servants. The small number of loyalist Space Marines were quite literally drowning under a torrent of red-skinned murder fiends. And whilst they put up a heroic resistance as Space Marines always do, they frankly were left with very little choice other than to bend on over, tuck their heads up between their cheeks and kiss their collective asses goodbye. Whereupon one assumes they found some sort of secret engraved upon their arse cheeks, because, out of seemingly nowhere, the loyalist Space Marines figured out how to trap the demons inside of their vehicles. Really now? Oh, you don't say. Wow. And then they did it, which I don't know which one I find more unbelievable. That they figured out how to do this on the fly, or that they all simply turned to one another and went, I don't want to die. This seems like the superior alternative. Again, warp fuckery, quite clearly. Regardless of how the heck this actually happened, though, the Golden Blades garrison was saved, as they managed to suck the warp-born souls of their attackers into their vehicles, trapping them in there for eternity. Or until the destruction of the vehicle, whereupon I imagine it would release some truly pissed-off demons, but details. That was a problem for tomorrow. And a very, very different chapter, too. Oh, well, not the chapter, as technically, theoretically, the Golden Blades could still be out there and loyal, but this force of them realized that they really liked demon-pimped vehicles. To the point where they made them the entire reason for existence. Honestly, the Khorn thing was mostly an afterthought. I'm not even kidding. They're not a Khornate warband at all. They seem to give no shits at all about standard Khornate operating procedure, e.g. charging, screaming towards the enemy. Instead, they still operate mostly as a mechanized loyalist Astartes force, utilizing silly things like tactics, organization, and strategy, all filthy, dirty words to any true Khornate warband. Their only real connection to the blood god Daddy-O is the red color scheme, which I again swear to Jeebus they adopted more because they thought it was cool rather than any actual affiliation to the origin ideology. This entire warband is basically just the Austrian man looking out at the socialist street protest and going, wow, I disagree with absolutely everything those guys are saying, but those are some snazzy colors. Red and gold, huh? And the rest was apparently history. Now, granted, they did get a bit more overtly Khornate later on, but still, indirectly. See, now that this group of the Golden Blades were no longer particularly fond of the Imperium because, presumably, its regulations on chromed-out rims was too oppressive. It could also have something to do with the fact that their new war vehicles were, in essence, their pets now. Pets that subsisted exclusively on a diet of souls, blood, pain, torment, of course. Which, to be fair, the Imperium does have a lengthy history of objecting rather stridently to. Realizing that there was no redemption for them, nor did they want it, they set out into the galaxy to find their place within it. And one was swiftly provided to them, presumably via Khornate intervention, as first and foremost, the Brazen Beasts came across a space hulk. Now, space hulks are not particularly common in the 41st millennium. They are vast amalgamations of various types of warships, or derelicts, or even asteroids that have been sucked into the warp through various, ill-fortuned adventures and mishaps, and then smashed together by the immeasurable forces of the Immaterium into a huge Frankenstein monstrosity of countless crunched shipped parts, often literally running molten one corridor into another, as if they were fused through reality itself, which, of course, they were. The point is, space hulks usually don't just pop into appearance for no reason whatsoever, so the fact that the Brazen Beasts found one as relatively easy as they did should have been suspicious to begin with. They quickly renamed their space hulk into the Oblivion Shadow. And the blessings did not stop there, because not only did the Oblivion Shadow possess all the space the Brazen Beasts could possibly ever require to store countless numbers of demon-infested war machines, it also came fully equipped with a brand new god for them to worship, the Caged God. A titanic Lord of Skulls, a war machine nestled deep in the heart of their new Space Hulk home. Well, that thing was the very personification of everything the Brazen Beasts found themselves to adore these days. He was huge, he was mechanical, and he was driven near exclusively by rage. Although, to be fair here as well, it is unclear whether or not the Caged Beast was already aboard the Space Hulk, or if they found it later. Technically, theoretically, it is also possible the Brazen Beasts could have constructed it as an idol for worship, or otherwise built it, but it's possible, but it's relatively unlikely. Lords of Skulls are very, very difficult to make. And one would think that if they had actually engaged in the process of creating the thing, some of the mystique around it would have, died off a little bit, in the same way that we would rarely find ourselves worshipping toasters. Although I am open to the counter-argument that a toaster capable of killing people and cleaving tanks in half might be able to put forth a sufficiently convincing argument to the opposite. Anyways, I prefer the idea that they found the Caged God within their brand new Space Hulk home because, well, the Caged God. It seems kind of to be in the name, really. And naturally, upon discovering their new deity, the Brazen Beasts set about not only worshipping it, but declaring it their de facto leader, as they recruited a vast collection of warpsmiths, both to communicate with the presumably constantly raging and screaming war machine now nestled neatly in the bowels of the Oblivion Shadow, in order for the warband to interpret its will. And it is largely the caged beast these days that directs the Brazen Beasts towards their next targets, as their agenda appears to be rather varied. They've fought everything from Eldars to Tyranids to other Chaos Space Marine Warband, and undoubtedly the occasional Imperials as well. This is where the Warband gets to demonstrate their decidedly un-Khornian tactics, as they utilize fully mechanized assault formations. Now, attacking something with vehicles is inherently somewhat more difficult than doing so with infantry. If all you've got is a horde of Chaos Berserkers, then the strategy and tactics are, well, kind of directly dictated to you, really. Grab them all up, organize them in a loose bunch, cluster of red power-armored little screaming maniacs, whereupon you point in the loose direction of the opposition and scream, "There!" And then you watch what happens. And that is about all you really can do with your average Khornate cultists, as it's not that you couldn't theoretically direct them, it's that they really don't want to. They really unironically have no interest in the entire process. However, the Brazen Beasts need to carry out mechanized assaults to make sure that all of their fancy little pets feel taken care of, and that they have got plenty of blood to run their little tracks through, of course. Feeding time is the most important time for pets of this nature, obviously. This means that they have got to organize vehicles. Vehicles are significantly larger than random dudes, and so if you want to have 10 rhinos assault a position, you've got to organize them a lot more carefully than you would the 100 dudes aboard those 10 rhinos. The 10 rhinos might require you to clear a path for them to approach through, for example, by destroying impediments like anti-tank traps or rough ground, or other things that might inconvenience the demon-infested war machines. Though I imagine the average rhino with a monster living inside of it is probably a bit more responsive to terrain features than your average steel can, one would imagine anyways. Still, there is clearly terrain that a vehicle simply cannot cross anywhere near as effectively as a dude on foot. Furthermore, a rhino is significantly larger than a human being, meaning that they've got to be organized side by side, and you've also got to make sure that they don't run into one another. A consideration made all the more challenging by the fact that these vehicles too are driven by a primordial lust for destruction, annihilation, and the bleeding of one's foes. It's not like you can simply just, point the steering wheel in a direction and assume the vehicle will continue going in a straight line. Therefore, to avoid any unnecessary dents or scrapes in the paint job, the Brazen Beasts actually organize fairly elaborate plans and strategies around deploying their war creatures into action, both using mechanized infantry, where the rhinos are used to carry the Brazen Beasts themselves into combat, and also sending in waves of defilers, mauler fiends and forge fiends ahead of the infantry, using the Brazen Beasts themselves to clear up the opposition that has been broken by the shock troopers of their heavy vehicle cavalry? I mean, sort of. Super heavy cav. That is, in essence, what things like mauler fiends and forge fiends are. The Brazen Beasts are just a bit more honest about it than many other chapters. Now, to many, this would be unfathomably wasteful, as the resources required to produce even a single defiler are significant, both in terms of raw material and in terms of the sacrifices required to create one and then further maintain one thereafter. Not to mention all of the specialized knowledge of the warpsmiths you need to obtain as well. But the Brazen Beasts have managed. They've managed a hell of a lot better than anyone else, in fact. Presumably this has to do, in some way, with the Caged God, or possibly the Oblivion Shadow, or possibly due to the Khorn's particular blessing upon the Brazen Beasts, as they seem to be able to do all of this far more easily than virtually any other Chaos Space Marine formation. Now, they do possess a significant number of warp smiths. Perhaps they have simply just looked harder for their numbers than anybody else, or encouraged the promulgation of their information and know-how to new adepts, conceivably. It is also a little bit unclear as to whether or not the warpsmiths are the ones running the warband, or whether or not the smiths themselves are prisoners of the warband, kept there solely to create more war machines and to take care of them afterwards. Now, the warpsmiths would also be the ones communicating with the Caged God, so one might also postulate that they could be indirectly in charge by simply pretending to understand what the giant screaming Lord of Skulls is actually saying. But, well, the problem here is, whilst this might very well work within the Imperium, and one could make a convincing argument that is exactly what is happening within the Imperium and the High Lords of Terror, who claim to be interpreting the God Emperor's will, etc., etc., the God Emperor is a different matter, because he isn't actually going to personally get off his chair to choke a bit to death when he translates incorrectly. A Lord of Skulls, however, very well might. Not to mention the other thousands of demonic creatures contained within the Oblivion Shadow, and bear you in mind as well, as you need actual demonic spirits to possess these war machines to make them effective, the Oblivion Shadow is either a natural locust point for a weakening of the veil of reality, or it knows exactly where to find all of these holes in reality, meaning that the entire Space Hulk itself is probably haunted to fuck and back by all manners of demonic creatures. Anyone aboard that ship that tries to pretend to speak for the demons, somehow I doubt they'd live long and prosper. In all due likelihood, the warpsmiths are as tied to the demon engines as the Brazen Beasts themselves are at this point. Little more than puppets in some grand invisible play. I mean, that's every Chaos Space Marine Warband at the end of the day, though I do admire the fact that the Brazen Beasts play out their part with a certain degree of resignation. They're not pretending to be Chaos Khornate followers. Not truly, as seen again with their utilization of strategy and tactics and organizations. The bastards even have unit numbers. They have logistics. They have ledgers. Rosters. I bet you they even take roll call. It is as if a loyalist force just ended up in this situation and realized, wow, we are not getting out of this one. Better make the best out of it. Yep, no, whatever the giant screaming statue thing desires, we are on board with that. And additionally as well, one must point out they have fought the Imperium relatively rarely too, at least as far as we know anyways. Who even is manipulating who? Are the warpsmiths interpreting the words of the Caged God creatively? Is the Caged God actually in charge of everything? Are the Brazen Beasts imprisoning both of them whilst pretending to serve some darker purpose? Or simply surviving? Not to say they haven't engaged Imperial forces at all. No, they have. In fact, they wiped out an entire Knight house at one point, which felt more like because they wanted to match their new pets up against Knights rather than any of real strategic purpose, as they specifically sought out the leader of the Knights to engage in a little bit of one-on-one demolition derby. In fact, demolition derby might be a surprisingly accurate description of their little row with House Hawkshroud. As they also picked a death world to do it on. Well, besides the Imperium, they've also fought Eldar and Tzeentch. Khorn obviously dislikes the Eldar, sneaky little gits, and Tzeentch as well for being, well, a dishonest little bitch. And a vile magic user. But perhaps most unusual is the fact that they've also encountered the Tyranids, specifically Hive Fleet Behemoth on a world by the name of Horus. Now, normally, the Chaos Gods are not particularly fond of going up against the Tyranids. Often because, to deal with the Tyranids, you really do need a much larger support structure than that available to the average Chaos Warband. Even the Iron Warriors have struggled on more than one occasion to hold off a Hive Fleet invasion. They simply don't have the backing, like the Imperium, for example, to organize large enough resistance, reserves, fleets, men, etc., to stand up to a splinter fleet. But the Brazen Beasts did just that. They found this world to be of such particular interest that they fought upon it to the bitter end. The beasts themselves were nearly annihilated in their engagements with this Hive fleet. But after deploying damn near the entire armory of demonic creatures, both small and large, Mauler fiends, the caged god itself, predators, land raiders, rhinos, any and all kinds of mechanical monstrosities, they were victorious against a Tyranid splinter fleet in a ground war. Jesus. The sheer quantity of armor they must have brought to this engagement. Suffice to say, the Warpsmiths were very busy recovering wrecks for presumably half a decade thereafter. They did get the bragging rights, though, as there's not a whole lot of forces out there in the galaxy that can claim to have won a ground war against the Nids. And that is the last known engagement of the Brazen Beasts as well, happening at the very end of the 41st millennium. Well, personally, I kind of hope we get a little bit more on these guys, because they have a fascinating little backstory, and we don't get enough Chaos Space Marine Warbands. Largely because, well, I guess they simply just don't sell as well as the Space Marines do. And unlike the Marines, of course, you can't simply primarify all of the Chaos ones to sell them again. Although, I'm sure we'll get to that eventually. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.